Welcome back to our final lecture on demand. We have been studying markets using the tools of supply and demand, and we have pretty much fully explained demand. We just have to clean it up with talking about how the non-price determinants of demand will cause a decrease in demand. However, it's good to reiterate an important point here. Even though we are teaching demand and we're analyzing these graphs, remember, you don't have a market until you have supply and demand brought together, buyers and sellers. However, it's impossible to teach supply and demand simultaneously, so we teach the demand side of the equation first. So in the previous lecture, we talked about how the non-price determinants of demand would cause an increase in demand, a rightward shift in the demand curve. Now we're going to talk about those same 5 non-price determinants of demand, but we'll analyze what would cause a decrease in demand, a leftward shift of the demand curve. The first non-price determinant, number 1 on your list over there on the right, is buyer's income. And typically, this is straightforward, is that when buyers have less money to spend because of a recession, we buy less of most items. And remember, we call those normal goods. Now, especially when you talk about what economists refer to as discretionary spending, so goods and services that we don't necessarily need, right? So when there's a recession, people tend to cut back on that type of spending. So a decrease in buyer's income causes a leftward shift in the demand curve, a decrease in demand. Just remember that most goods and services are normal goods. There are the rare exceptions of what we refer to as inferior goods, so things like used cars, retreaded tires, secondhand clothing, generic items. So a decrease in buyer's income will decrease demand as long as we're analyzing a market for a normal good. Number 2, taste and preferences. This one's probably the easiest to explain. Goods and services come in and out of fashion, in and out of favor, in and out of popularity. So we could talk again about the corn market. In a previous lecture, we talked about what would make corn more preferable to buyers at every price level in the market. Well, imagine if you were to pick up a newspaper tomorrow morning. You picked up the Chicago Tribune or the New York Times, and it said, eating corn increases your chance of colon cancer by 28%. Well, obviously this wouldn't be good news for corn farmers, and ceteris paribus, other things being equal, people would tend to decrease the demand for corn. There'd be a leftward shift in the demand for corn because people would have less taste or preference for corn. And number 3, number of buyers, right? So in a previous lecture, we talked about there was an increase in the number of buyers in the corn market because of the ethanol policy, a whole new group of buyers in this market. What if we discontinue the ethanol policy? What if we're no longer producing a bio-based fuel, a biodiesel fuel with corn? So those producers of ethanol no longer want to buy corn. There will be a decrease in the number of buyers, a leftward shift. Another good example of this, if you think about the baby boomer era in the United States, post-World War II, well, that went on for the better part of 25 years. During that era, there was a huge increase in the demand for things like cribs and all kinds of baby foods or anything related to baby items. And then when that era ended, when Americans weren't having as many kids, there were fewer buyers in the markets for all goods and services related to infants. So there was a decrease in the number of buyers, a leftward shift in demand, a movement from D to D1. Now, price of a substitute. It's always good to come up with a concrete example of substitute goods. So let's use the same example we used for an increase in demand in the opposite direction this time. Assume for a moment, if you would, that corn and potatoes are substitutes. So assume that they're both equally preferable to consumers. So what happens in the market for corn if there's a decrease in the price of potatoes? Well, if there's a decrease in the price of a substitute good, right, assuming that the price of corn has not changed, there's going to be a decrease in the demand for corn, a leftward shift in demand. Right? Complementary goods. Well, let's think about 2 services that might be complementary. So for instance, Vegas vacations and hotel stays. So typically when you go to Vegas vacation, you fly there, right? You fly to Vegas. So what happens? Let's assume we're analyzing the market for hotel rooms in Las Vegas. what happens to the demand for hotel rooms in Las Vegas if the price of airfare to and from Vegas increases? Because those two services are complementary. You need to take an airplane to get to Vegas, or most of us do. I'm sure some people live in Las Vegas. So if there's an increase in the price of a complement, in this case the airline service to get to Vegas, there's a decrease in the demand for rooms and hotel stays in Vegas. Now, expectations, the final non-price determinant. Remember, there's three types of expectations. There's expectations about future product price, expectations about future product availability, and expectations about future income. So if consumers expect prices to fall in the future, assuming they can hold off the purchase of the item, there's going to be a decrease in demand today. Because remember, markets analyze series of prices for a specified amount of time. So if this is demand for, let's say, automobiles, right? So if it's a demand for automobiles, let's say it's springtime, and let's say consumers expect prices of automobiles to drop later in the summer towards fall. Well, if that's the case, and most people can postpone the purchase of a large item like that, there's a decrease in demand today if we expect lower prices in the future. All right, product availability, well, this one's not quite as applicable as the example I gave you for increase in demand. All right, but, if we say, okay, what would happen if we assume that there'd be plenty of product available tomorrow? We're not really worried about it being available, so there'd be a decrease in demand for the product today. And then expectations about future income. Well, this one actually does have some good real-life application. Imagine if you're sitting around the lunch table at work, and it used to be Mary Jo, Bob, Tom, and Eric sitting there, and now it's just two of those participants because the other hardworking people had to be laid off because of the recession. So what happens is that when we're in a recession, many workers, especially blue-collar workers who've seen other line workers been laid off, they tend to worry about their future income because they're not too convinced that they're going to have a job 3-6 months from now. So they tend to decrease the demand, especially for those discretionary items we mentioned earlier. So if you think about a trip to Walt Disney World, obviously not something you absolutely positively need in your life. When workers have a fear for their income in the future, there's a decrease in the demand for many goods and services today.